Welcome to the National Book Awards Campus Weekend at Concordia College. I am Mark Ricci, Vice President for Academic Affairs, and I extend greetings to those here this evening, as well as others who are watching through our video production presented on the internet. I am pleased to introduce the participants in tonight's readings and conversation session. First, let us welcome National Book Award finalist in nonfiction, Rajiv Chandrasekaran. A finalist for his book, Imperial Life in the Emerald City. This work chronicles his time as the Washington Post's Baghdad bureau chief after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Mr. Chandrasekaran was the longest-serving U.S. reporter in the country after the invasion, and his book describes the efforts taken by the U.S. administration to rebuild the country and the impact of these efforts on the Iraqi people. Rajiv is an assistant managing editor at the Washington Post. In addition to experience in Iraq, he's also covered the war in Afghanistan and recently served as a journalist in residence at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. Next, let us welcome National Book Award finalist in poetry, Ben Lerner. Mr. Lerner was nominated for his second book of poetry, Angle of Yah, a work that was described by Publishers Weekly as reflecting an extended meditation on the commercialization of public space and speech. In this work, he writes about emotion and identity while leaving the reader wondering how much of this poetry is introspective autobiography or social commentary. Mr. Lerner's first book was named by Library Journal as one of the best poetry books in 2004. A former Fulbright scholar to Spain, Ben teaches at the California College of the Arts. He also co-edits the journal No, a Journal of the Arts. And our third guest tonight is Harold Augenbraum. Mr. Augenbraum is the Executive Director of the National Book Foundation. In addition to his role as Executive Director, Mr. Augenbraum is well known for his scholarship on Latino literary studies. Our three guests are joined by Concordia College President Pamela Joliker. Once again, let us welcome our guests to Concordia College.
Well, I'd like to kick this conversation off by asking you, Harold, to tell us something about the National Book Awards. We know that they are among the most prestigious awards. Okay, they are the most prestigious. Could you tell us something about it? Well, you just did, about the place of these awards in the spectrum of literary awards and the process by which the finalists are selected.
Well, thank you for inviting us here. We really appreciate it. This is our second year here. We're very pleased with our partnership with Concordia College and enjoy coming up here, especially since it's before mud season. The National Book Awards was founded in 1950, and one of the things as we sort of look into the history of the National Book Awards, why they were founded, like most book awards, they were founded out of dissatisfaction with other awards. So the publishing community was sort of unhappy, and this is all hearsay, but I love I love rumor and innuendo. So they were, supposedly the publishing community was upset because William Faulkner had never won a Pulitzer Prize. So what do you do when you don't get what you want in one of the prize communities? Either you stack the juries, which is hard to do, or you found your own prize. So in 1950, the publishing community founded a prize, and lo and behold, in the first 6 years, William Faulkner won 2 National Book Awards. Interesting because they were for minor works that he probably wouldn't even have considered his great works. One of them was for collected stories, the other was for a fable. But the National Book Awards sort of grew in stature, I think, because they were supported by the publishing community, and they're really called the Oscars of the the literary world, partly because of their status of writers giving awards to writers, but also part of it, I think, is part of the social situation of the black tie dinner in New York City. I think that sort of all goes together. The awards process starts actually in January when we go to about 450 writers across the country. We ask them for nominations for judges. We then put together the panels in the 4 categories: fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and young people's literature. The 5 panelists all have to be writers in that genre. Then in April, actually, tomorrow, the guidelines are sent out to about 2,000 members of the publishing community across the country. The publishers are the only ones who can enter books for the National Book Awards. Last year, in the 4 categories, a little over 1,200 books were nominated. 175 poetry books, 230 young people's literature, 275 in fiction, and 538 in nonfiction. Now, the judges get these books beginning in June, and they've got to have their finalists done by the end of September. So if you do the math, that's 3.5 months for, in the case of nonfiction, reading 538 books. And every judge tells me that they read every word of every book. This is a good time to pull up my socks. And they swear it on we usually, until last year, we'd been getting about 400 books a year in the nonfiction category, and then it shot up for some reason to close to 540. And we hadn't told the panel that there were going to be that many. We didn't expect that many. And what was interesting was after it was over, I got a call a week later from one of the judges in nonfiction who told me that I owed him a new pair of contact lenses. And I thought, well, I'm not going to give him a new pair of contact lenses, but I talked to him for a while, because he had to read so many books. And then about a week after that, another judge called me and said he wanted a trip to the Caribbean. And I thought, there's something going on here. And about a week later, a third judge called and he said, I talked to the so-and-so and so-and-so, and I'd like a new car. He said, no, that doesn't really work that way. But what I'm trying to get at is that it's a lot of work for the judges. And they're really, really, really very dedicated, and they do a lot of work. One judge said to me when I was on the phone with him, Harold, I have to get off the phone. I have to read my 600 pages today. So they work very, very hard. In the beginning of October, they choose the finalists. We announce them second week of October. Last year, we announced them at City Lights Bookstore in San Francisco. Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the poet, did the announcement. And in the middle of November, all the judges come to New York. They separate into their various panels. They go to a very nice restaurant in New York, which is one of their perks. And they're not allowed to get up from the luncheon table until they've chosen a National Book Award winner. And that night, they're announced from the stage at the Marriott Marquis in New York City. Nobody knows who the National Book Award winner. We don't even know. We do not take part as staff people in the selection process of the deliberations at all. When it's announced from the stage, that's when we find out as well.
Thank you, Harold. Well, I'm wondering what it must be like on the receiving end to be awarded something that your peers, writers in your field, has determined is the best book in that genre. So I'd like to know from the two of you what it was like when you got that call. What was the first thought that went into your head? What was the second thought that came into your head? How did that feel? Ben, what about you?
I thought there must have been a mistake. The first thought was that it just surprised me. I felt young for the award, young for the honor. You have the sense of prospects opening up. You have the sense of the possibility of new readers. And I also had the sense that I had to find a tuxedo, which I had never worn, but maybe in high school, my high school prom. So I immediately went shopping for a used tuxedo. But it was, I mean, it's wonderful, especially at the National Book Awards, because the judges tend to be such prestigious figures in the field, and a diverse group of figures in the field, that, I mean, it was an overwhelming honor, and it's humbling, both because of the poets who have been finalists in the past, and also because of the poets who have not. So, yeah, I mean, I was honored, humbled, overwhelmed, confused, and so on, and very happy.
One morning I get this voicemail from some guy named Harold at the National Book Foundation. I listen to it. I guess he wants like a free copy of the book or something. And I hit save on it and I walked off to work. Didn't even return his call right away. And I think I was in between appointments. I figured I should just call this guy back. What does he want? And they put me through to him, and he tells me that I'm a finalist for the National Book Award in nonfiction. And I was like, what? It was just inconceivable to me. I don't really consider myself to be much of a writer. I'm a newspaper guy who spent many years sort of struggling to write a basic 1,000-word story for the Washington Post. And when I set about to work on my book, I was convinced that nobody would read it. You know, back when I started writing in late 2004, bookstore shelves were groaning under the weight of unsold Iraq books, and I just figured this would vanish into some black hole. And when I finally even after I talked to you, I wasn't sure that I was being punked. It wasn't until I got back to my office and I Googled National Book Awards and I saw that indeed one Harold Augenbraum was the executive director of the National Book Foundation, that I thought, okay, maybe this is, maybe there is something to this. And I've got to say that since then, in all of the reviews the book has received, the other lesser honors, that being a finalist for the National Book Award, even though I didn't win it, being a finalist for it has meant more to me than anything else.
I could understand how both of you would be surprised because you hadn't spent decades longing for this kind of recognition. I think, Ben, a decade ago you were graduating from high school, so it probably didn't occur to you that you might be a finalist for the book award. But I am curious, you just started talking about that, Rajiv, is how it's affected your life since then and your career prospects.
Well, let's put it this way. The Oscars of the book world, it's still the Oscars of the book world. It's not like, the big, broad, general public knows who I am. I was not splashed on the cover of Entertainment Weekly or anything like that. But that seal on the book jacket, I think, gives it an awful lot of attention in bookstores. I think it shamed the New York Times Book Review into doing a review. I don't think Sam Tannehouse was planning on it, and it got them to review the book, which was always nice, being somebody who works for the Washington Post, to jab it at them that way. I think that it's drawn attention to a story that I think is a very important story. I spent many months, more than a year of my life working on this book because I felt it was an awfully important story to get out there. And I think that being recognized by the National Book Awards has helped to increase exposure to a very pressing subject for the American people. And I'm very grateful for that.
There's no question that it's useful for a career. I mean, as someone who's in a kind of an academic economy, it makes it easier to negotiate leave and things like that, or time to do your work. But that aside, I think the effect it's had on me is it's reminded me to be ambitious. I mean, to compare myself not just to the writing that I see before me if I glance through some magazines, although some of that writing is excellent, but also to try to have some sense of the historical legacy of the art and to try to be worthy of the honor, in that sense of measuring yourself against great writers. And of course, always falling short, but nonetheless, the measurement itself can be propulsive for an artist, I think.
You're both young enough that I think our students might be able at least to identify with you. And I'd be curious to have you tell them a little bit about the connection, if any, between your undergraduate studies, your undergraduate majors, and where you are now. We could start with Rajiv. And curiously, both of them majored in political science. Yours was political theory, and
Mine was barely enough units to graduate. I majored in political science because it was the major at Stanford that required the least number of classes within that major to get my diploma. Seriously, I will be very frank about that. Look, I started out as a chemical engineering major, and well, it wasn't for me. And I think the only reason I know the only reason I indicated that as my major was because my dad was a chemical engineer, and as the son of Indian immigrants, I was told in no uncertain terms that if I didn't pursue studies in either engineering or the sciences, that I would probably amount to nothing, or at least not much of anything. And we had a nice knockdown, drag-out fight, my parents and I, after my sophomore year when I announced my intention to change to political science. And the reason for this was very simple. I was spending all of my time at the student newspaper, and that was my passion. Stanford did not have an undergraduate program in journalism. I knew I wanted to be a reporter, and I figured the best way to go about it was to spend as much time as possible writing stories, editing stories, and political science was the one major that offered me the opportunity to while away countless hours of the day at the newspaper offices and devote comparatively little time to studying. So I have to confess, I was not of a very academic background. I barely did the readings required for the classes, but I had a passion about it. But please, don't take this to heart. Don't go and blow off your studies because I was an idiot and did that. But I was very passionate about something, and I spent an awful lot of time. I mean, I probably put in 12-hour days at the newspaper, and even longer when I edited it. And my job as the editor of the Stanford Daily, I think, to this day is the greatest responsibility I ever had. I was supervising 100 people and running an independent student organization with a budget of $1.2 million. But that's what led me. After my time there, I got an internship at the Washington Post, and I've never left the Post. I've been there now for more than 13 years. But I guess the one lesson I take from all of it is my undergraduate years offered me an opportunity to pursue a passion. And in my case, it was not a passion that fit nicely under a particular major in a particular academic program. But my undergraduate environment allowed me to open my eyes to the world of journalism, to practice the trade craft, to get better at it, and eventually get a job in that field. And I think that's the key connection between then and now.
I mean, I think poetry as an interest hasn't been around for me my whole life, but an interest in language has always been primary in my experience. And I think that a sense of the political uses and misuses of language has always been important to me. So when I went to college, I took some literature courses, but the books that actually spoke to me were the kind of canon of modern political thought, works by people like Thomas Hobbes and Machiavelli and John Locke and later Hannah Arendt and thinkers like that, because they were trying to imagine forms of just social organization using the medium of language, and of course language is the form of social exchange. So for me, reading the canon of modern political thought was actually a way to interrogate the relationship between language and power. And that interest hasn't gone away with poetry. I mean, my poetry is as influenced by the canon of modern political thought as it is by other poetry, because I'm always trying to be attentive to the relationship between a particular discourse and power, and to try to make our language strange again, so we can look with fresh eyes at the language that we have to use in our day-to-day lives, and in our imagining just forms of social organization. So for me, there's no break between studying political theory and writing poetry. They're just two different forms for reckoning with the political importance of language. I also blew off plenty of my classes. But those books did and do really count for me.
In future years, can we vet the undergraduate records?
I'm never going to ask that question again. Ben, will you read some of your work for us? Some of your poetry?
Sure. Did we agree to stand?
I think so.
So I thought I'd read kind of a group of prose poems from the second book that I think will indicate the intersection of my interest in poetry and politics. But these are all from Angle of Yaw. When night falls in the Middle West, we divide the multiple fruit of the pig. A drunk man calls out for traditional shepherd's music, addressing the theme of love. Scratch that, the theme of boredom. The children are made to recite the office of the shutting of the eyes. The salt shaker is full of pepper, the pepper shaker glitter. At the bottom of every drained pool, there I are, there we am, open-mouthed, awaiting the small, angular rain. A drunk man brews a second cup, one for each fist. Great tufts of white carpet pulled out in grief. Scratch that, in boredom. In the planar region bounded by our counterglow, no means no, so does yes. Everything we own is designed to be easily washed, unlike the aprons of the butchers that we are. The first gaming system was the domesticated flame. Contemporary video games allow you to select the angle from which you view the action, inspiring a rash of high school massacres. Newer games, with their use of small strokes to simulate reflected light, are all but unintelligible to older players. We have abstracted airplanes from our simulators in the hope of manipulating flight as such. Gain sheets, special codes that make your character invincible or rich, alter weather conditions, or allow you to bypass a narrative stage, stand in relation to video games as prayer to reality. Children, if pushed, will attempt to inflict gain cheats on the phenomenal world. Enter up, down, left, right, A, B, A, to tear open the sky. Left, B, B, to keep warm. He had enough respect for painting to quit. Enough respect for quitting to paint. Enough respect for the figure to abstract, for abstraction to hint at the breast, for the breast to ask the model to leave. But I live here, says the model, and I respect that, says the painter, but I have enough respect to insist, for insistence to turn the other cheek, for the other cheek to turn the other cheek. Hence, I appear to be shaking my head no. Reading is important because it makes you look down in an expression of shame. When the page is shifted to a vertical plane, it becomes an advertisement, decree, and/or image of a missing pet or child. We say that texts displayed vertically are addressed to the public, while in fact, by failing to teach us the humility a common life requires, they convene a narcissistic mass. When you window shop, when you shatter a store window, you see your own image in the glass. Returning astronauts almost always fall into a deep depression. They are stricken with an uncontrollable desire to gain weight. At dusk, you will see them circling the park in silk pajamas, mocked by children, trailed by dogs. Prolonged weightlessness destroys the bones, the muscles, and eventually the larynx, which is why when astronauts return to Earth, we find that their speech has been reduced to a kind of quiet piping, at once soft and shrill, that is intelligible only to other astronauts, a piping that approaches but is not, despite the government's assertions, song. The artist proposes a series of lights attached to tall poles, spaced at intervals along our public roads, and illuminated from dusk to dawn. The public is outraged. The law's long arm cannot support its heavy hand. The public is outraged. Kindergartners simulate bayonet fighting with the common domestic foul. Does this blood look good on me? Does this blood make me look fat? If you replace a cow's stomach with glass, don't complain when you cut your mouth. Harold, could you pass me water, please? We are pleased to offer a lamp that turns on and off when you clap your eyes. A lamp that lets you see in the dark without disturbing the dark. A lamp producing natural light. A lamp that when you clap turns on and on. The rose has a minutely serrate margin, like a poem. There ends analogy, a dying process. At the border of the cornea and sclera, a momentary wavering. Excluded from beatific vision, but not condemned to further punishment. In the dream, she told me she felt fine, like dust. To what shall we liken analogy, if not to hypermetropia? These carpets are the color of migraine. Note to self, change your life. I assume the palmate antlers of hoofed mammals have so often been likened to candelabra, I'm not even going to try. Boy, you got trouble in your head. Every time, he says, breasts are described in the poems of men, a woman undergoes mastectomy. I said, he says, to gain some credibility. which is a privileged form of distance. This one goes out to Grandma Elsie, short for Elsewhere, whom I never met. This one goes out to Grandma Rosie, who couldn't remember her first cancer by the time she died of being ready. Her ashes are on a shelf in Cambridge, awaiting scattering. Note to self, don't publish this. Besides the half-dead and their families, everybody in the home was from the Indies, carpets the color of. We administered music and morphine. For 94 years, she had performed her gender admirably. Anyway, this isn't a time or a place, but the day she died, some punk nearly hit me with his bike, parked it, and got all in my face. Boy, you got trouble in your head. I started to cry, like a woman, he said, as if to give me strength. Women have no desire to travel in outer space. When men have forced women to travel in outer space, the results have been disastrous. If you mention space travel to a woman, she will say, "Don't even go there." She will say, "You can't go home again." She will say, "Been there, done that." That there is more space inside one small woman than in all of heaven has been verified experimentally. She will say, "Have I gained weight?" She will say, "I no longer love you," and or, "I'm not sure I ever loved you." She will say, "Most theorists believe the universe is flat." The first woman in space is still there. The man observes the action on the field with the tiny television he brought to the stadium. He is topless, painted gold, bewigged. His exaggerated foam index finger indicates the giant screen upon which his own image is now displayed, a model of fanaticism. He watches the image of his watching the image on his portable TV, on his portable TV. He suddenly stands with arms upraised and initiates the wave that will consume him. Hideaway beds were not invented to maximize space, but to conceal the unseemly reality of prostration. Thomas Jefferson, who held the first United States patent on a hideaway bed, devised a system of elevating and securing the bed to the ceiling. Each night, the bed would be lowered slowly and with great ceremony, thereby associating the animal fact of sleep with the plane of the divine. The contemporary hideaway bed, which is stored vertically, has snapped shut and killed at least 10 businessmen. Most people can be trained to sleep standing up, to sleep with their eyes open, to somniloquize, to somnambulate. Mobilizing this tremendous dormant workforce is an ancient dream. Astronauts sleep strapped to their beds, like lunatics they are. The dark crowd cannot be seen directly. The dark crowd does not interact with light, but the dark crowd can be detected by measuring its gravitational effects on visible crowds. The visible crowd moves toward the dark crowd as insects toward a black light trap in the tropism we call history. Riot guns with rubber bullets, tear gas, water cannons, flying wedges of heavily armored police are not only incapable of dispersing the dark crowd, but by inciting a phase change in the visible crowd, expand its ranks. People with all manner of phobia, a fear of heights, or crowds, or marketplaces, public speaking, or blood, or prime numbers, have been known to overcome their panic by wearing glasses, not with corrective lenses, but with lenses of plain shatterproof plastic, which not only impose immediate plane between them and the object of their fear, but apply a comforting pressure to the bridge of the nose. When you encounter a person seized by terror, softly squeeze this bony structure, and he will be instantaneously subdued. In an age of contact lenses and laser surgery, it is safe to assume that a person who persists in wearing glasses is undergoing treatment. When we saw the pattern, we took the kids out of school, broke out the special water. 2 churches linked by a sudden alley through the corn, as the Hopi myth foretells, a massive loss of technology. A spider leaves a string between 2 points. Think about it. From the duster, it appears a thing of glory. Makes you reconsider the whole idea of property. Stems inside formations have blown nodes. Explain that, Mr. TV. Part of the confusion involves words. We wake up with mud on our feet. The other part is just the way we are, scared of the new when it's thousands of years old. If you have never seen a sleeping toddler crawl beyond the lip of porch light, zip it. If my meaning is clear, it's already too late. For God's sake, people, open your hearts. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. What a beautiful use of language. Both your book, The Angle of Yaw, and yours, Rajiv, Imperial Life in the Emerald City, have a theme one theme that you might have been able to detect in the readings of disappointment. Whether it's the fact that our actions as Americans don't live up to our ideals, or that the very technology that we have wrought doesn't do for us, doesn't enhance our lives. Could you both talk about that? In your case, Ben, in some ways it seems more explicit in your poetry than it does in your story, Rajiv. But could you both comment on that? Has America lost its way? Temporarily?
Well, I mean, I think that in a sense, because of the ambitions that are figured at the inception of this country, right? I mean, how ambitious a project the United States was, and continues to be. Disappointment falling short of the possibilities figured in, say, the founding documents of the country. I think disappointment's always going to be there. I think there's healthy disappointment, and then there's unhealthy disappointment, right? Like a healthy disappointment would be dissatisfaction with the status quo and agitating for change, whereas an unhealthy disappointment would be, complacency and inaction. And in my book, there come two kinds of disappointment, I think, however obliquely they're experienced in the poems. And there's the kind of disappointment that shares a wall with despair, which is just to say, the environment is sick, the people are suffering, and it seems to have always been that way, there's nothing we can do about it, let's just watch more TV. That mode of disappointment, which is very despairing. And then there's this other mode of disappointment, which often enters the book around the word no, which is a very important word in the text. And that's a more active, and that's not just like passive disappointment, that's thinking about alternatives. That's saying no to the limitations of the status quo and using the power of negative thinking to try to move us towards imagining alternatives. I think that one thing poetry can do is give the language, refresh the language so we're able to return to the possibilities figured in, say, founding documents. And that we have to kind of take language back from political doublespeak, from the language of advertising, in order to be able to think creatively about more just modes of, say, social engagement or forms of life in common.
Expressing my disappointment, which I think comes out implicitly in the text of my book rather than explicitly, was a big risk for me. It would have been easy and perhaps politically expedient to have written a book where the underlying subtext was kind of, I told you so, or didn't we know this all along? Boy, these people who went into it, they should have known that all of this was going to amount to a big mess, a bunch of trouble. But I felt I had to be honest with the reader when it came to how I viewed this at the outset. I thought that if the United States marshaled the requisite resources, brought the right people to the task, brought the very best of what makes our country what it is, brought that to the challenge of trying to reconstruct and govern Iraq after Saddam Hussein, that maybe we could have pulled it off. It wouldn't have been perfect. It would have always been a little messy, but we could have accomplished something meaningful, something that we might have been able to look at in a, at least in the medium term and at least be a little proud of. And of course, that didn't happen, and it was, my disappointment informed and affected the way I viewed how the occupation of Iraq unfolded. And, there are a number of people who were skeptical from the get-go. I actually thought that trying to, again, implicitly put the arc of my view and the arc of my disappointment in there made the narrative all the more powerful. And it was true. It was true to my feelings, my view of the situation.
But in the telling of your stories, you let the situation and the characters convey that. You're less conscious of your point of view in the way you've constructed it at the end. Both of your writings are both personal and political. It's clear, I suppose, with a poet always, where the personal comes in. Less clear, that's why we said maybe it was indirect in your piece.
That's right. I didn't want the book to be overly self-referential. I felt that there was an awful lot of journalist memoirs that were, quite frankly, microwaved after the initial invasion of Iraq. Books that didn't really have much resonance that I don't think will have much staying power, that were just because of the way the publishing industry works. There was an appetite to simply get kind of big name media figures out in the bookstores with some sort of book. And, you know, I looked at what I was doing there and I said, you know, at the end of the day, who's really going to care about me? This is about the Iraqis. This is about all the Americans who have taken great risks to help Iraq. Some who have accomplished things productive, some who haven't. It's a story about people who have died and been wounded. You know, I'm not really a big character in this. And as I spent time in Iraq and as I got to know various people from very disparate backgrounds, from 20-something recent college graduates who showed up for a little bit of fun, thinking that this was going to be, you know, summer camp in the desert with some guns, to gray-haired veteran diplomats eager for one last taste of adventure. I began to really get drawn in by these people and their stories, and I became convinced that the way to tell the story of the American effort to try to rebuild and govern Iraq was really to tell it through individual people and let them essentially speak for themselves, tell their stories, and my views come through again between the lines. At the end of the day, I decided which characters to emphasize and which not to, which stories to focus on and which not to. It wasn't like I disgorged everything from all of my reporting into the book. But the way I tried to weave that through, I tried to convey a little bit of how I felt, or perhaps a lot of how I felt, without sort of resorting to the I, and me.
But why don't you read to us from Life in the Emerald City?
Love to. I'm going to read two different selections from the book. The first is from the first chapter of the book. The Green Zone quickly became Baghdad's Little America. Everyone who worked in the palace lived there, either in white metal trailers or in the towering Al Rashid Hotel. Hundreds of private contractors working for firms including Bechtel, General Electric, and Halliburton set up trailer parks there, as did legions of private security guards hired to protect the contractors. The only Iraqis allowed inside the Green Zone were those who worked for the Americans, or those who could prove that they resided there before the war. Americans drove around in brand new GMC Suburbans, dutifully obeying the 35-mile-an-hour speed limit signs posted by the CPA on the flat, wide streets. There were so many identical Suburbans parked in front of the palace that drivers had to use their electronic door openers as homing devices. One contractor affixed Texas license plates to his vehicle to set it apart. When they cruised around, they kept the air conditioning on high and the radio tuned to 107.7 FM, Freedom Radio, an American-run station that played classic rock mixed with rah-rah messages. Every 2 weeks, the vehicles were cleaned at a Halliburton car wash. Shuttle buses looped around the Green Zone at 20-minute intervals, stopping at wooden shelters to transport those who didn't have cars and didn't want to walk. There was daily mail delivery. Generators ensured that the lights were always on. If you didn't like what was being served in the cafeteria, or you were feeling peckish between meals, you could get takeout from one of the Green Zone's Chinese restaurants. Halliburton's dry cleaning service would get the dust and sweat stains out of your khakis in 3 days. A sign asked patrons to please remove the ammunition from their pockets before submitting clothes. Iraqi laws and customs didn't apply inside the Green Zone. Women jogged on the sidewalk in shorts and T-shirts. A liquor store sold imported beer, wine, and spirits. One of the Chinese restaurants offered massages, as well as noodles. The young boys selling DVDs near the palace parking lot had a secret stash. "Mister, you want porno?" they whispered to me. If there was any law in the green zone, it was American. Military police pulled drivers over for speeding and drunk driving. When a shipment of office safes arrived, Halliburton prevented its American employees from lifting or delivering them until hand trucks and back braces had been sent to Baghdad. When one CPA staffer complained that she needed her safe, she said she was storing tens of thousands of dollars in her office toilet. A Halliburton representative said it had to follow American occupational safety regulations. Veteran diplomats who had lived in the Arab world or had worked in post-conflict situations wanted local cuisine in the dining room, a respect for local traditions, and a local workforce. But they were in the minority. Most of the CPA staff had never worked outside the United States. More than half, according to one estimate, had gotten their first passport in order to travel to Iraq. If they were going to survive in Baghdad, they needed the same sort of bubble that American oil companies had built for their workers in Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and Indonesia. From inside the green zone, the real Baghdad, the checkpoints, the bombed-out buildings, the paralyzing traffic jams could have been a world away. The horns, the gunshots, the muezzins' call to prayer never drifted over the walls. The fear on the faces of American troops was rarely seen by the denizens of the palace. The acrid smoke of a car bomb didn't fill the air. The sub-Saharan privation and Wild West lawlessness that gripped one of the world's most ancient cities swirled around the walls, but on the inside, the calm sterility of an American subdivision prevailed. In between my chapters, I have these little vignettes, scenes from the green zone. Let me read you one of my favorites before going to the last section here. The green zone, scene 8. The corkboard in the bar at Ocean Cliffs, the British housing compound, was the green zone's version of the Hyde Park Speaker's Corner. There was a photograph of President Bush dressed as Marlon Brando in The Wild One, in a leather jacket and touring cap, sitting atop a motorcycle. Be afraid, the caption read, because paranoia is patriotic. Another parodied a poster for the movie Jackass. It depicted the Bush administration's foreign policy team in a shopping cart, flying off a cliff. Other postings involved less graphic design acumen. A handwritten sign admonished, "Yeehaw is not a foreign policy." If any of you have been keeping up with the news today, you will have heard that a suicide bomber was able to penetrate the Iraqi parliament building, the cafeteria for the parliament, inside the green zone today, detonating an explosives-laden vest that has killed at least 8 people and injured more than a dozen. And so I thought it would be interesting to read from chapter 9 of the book that involves the first significant attack on the green zone in the fall of 2003. The Al Rashid Hotel was a concrete and glass monstrosity built by the Oberoi Group of India in the 1980s, before Saddam's manic spending spree on weapons to defeat Iran, and before the invasion of Kuwait made Iraq an international pariah. When the Al Rashid opened, its 428 guest rooms had buttery leather chairs, color televisions, touch-tone phones, wall-to-wall carpeting, and marble-floored bathrooms. Downstairs, the Sherazade bar poured Johnny Walker Black Label. The 1001 Nights disco teemed with dolled-up call girls, and a shopping arcade stocked French perfume. A medical clinic staffed with a European doctor tended to guests' aches and pains. After the Kuwait War, United Nations sanctions forced the Oberoi Group to leave the country. Saddam's government took over the Al Rashid and every other foreign hotel in the country. The cash-strapped finance ministry eliminated the Al Rashid's maintenance budget. For a few years, nobody noticed. Then the elevators broke, the linens frayed, and the toilets began to leak. By the time I paid my first visit to the hotel in 2002, the leather chairs had faded and cracked, the mattresses sagged, and I had to bribe the cleaning man for a roll of toilet paper. Most of the phones didn't work, and the televisions displayed only a half-dozen channels, all of which were run by the government. Saddam's regime didn't allow CNN or the BBC in the hotel. My fellow guests and I suspected that Saddam's secret police had hidden bugs in the televisions. A week before the war, the Pentagon warned American news organizations to vacate the Al-Rashid. A big bunker underneath the hotel put it on the target list. But those of us on the ground knew better. As decrepit as it had become, it was still the best place to sleep in town. The Americans would want to stay there when they came. The first wave of American civilians moved into the Republican Palace instead. Their security advisors said that the 14-story Al-Rashid, which soared over neighborhood buildings, was too vulnerable to an attack. But as the palace began overflowing with people, the threat assessment changed. The CPA's security officers deemed the hotel safe enough to bed hundreds of employees who had been sleeping on cots in the palace, waiting for housing trailers that Halliburton was supposed to bring to Baghdad. The job of running the Al-Rashid fell to Halliburton, which promptly rehired dozens of the hotel's pre-war employees, including several I suspected were former intelligence agents. Little was done to renovate the rooms, but the company did reopen the disco and set up a sports bar in the basement bunker. The hotel became the place to party in the Emerald City. Colonel Elias Nimmer yawned and rolled over. He had opened his eyes 10 minutes earlier, at 6 o'clock, as the first sliver of the sun edged above the horizon and transformed the desert sky from a deep indigo to a light blue. His roommate was away and Nimmer hadn't bothered to close the curtains before going to sleep. After almost 3 decades in the Army, his body was accustomed to waking at sunrise. When Nimmer stood at his west-facing window in room 916, he could gaze down on an 8-lane expressway, and beyond that, the city zoo and a surrounding park, a dusty expanse with wilting plants and decrepit buildings. To the left were the most famous monuments erected by Saddam, a giant ziggurat to commemorate the war with Iran, and a military parade ground bookended with massive arches in the shape of human arms, reportedly modeled after Saddam's own, hoisting crossed swords. I need to get up, Nimmer thought. It was a Sunday, and he didn't have to report for duty at the Republican Palace until 11. But he sensed that it would be a pleasant morning. He contemplated going for a walk before getting an early start at work. He was the chief budget officer for the CPA team that worked with Iraq's Ministry of Health. It was an exceedingly complex job, but Nimmer, a naturalized American citizen who was born in Lebanon and spoke Arabic, had plenty of experience. He'd been the chief budget officer for the Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. Nimmer was a beefy man with a square jaw, a pointy nose, and a swarthy complexion. His receding graying hair had been buzzed with Army regulation clippers. He yawned and thought about catching a few more minutes of shut-eye. Should I or shouldn't I? Should I? Or a deafening explosion rocked the hotel and the building shuddered. Nimmer jolted awake. Oh my God, he thought. They've finally done it. Instinct took over and Nimmer rolled onto the floor. Nobody ever fires one rocket, he thought. More are coming. The safest place was on the ground, as far from the window as possible. He couldn't slide under the bed because he was too large to fit onto the low box spring. He did the next best thing. He lay on his stomach between the bed and his roommates. It's like a trench down here. I'll be safe. It was October 26, 2003, 6.5 months after the American troops had arrived in Baghdad. Insurgents had targeted the Al-Rashid with rockets a month earlier, but it had been a Wile E. Coyote affair. The projectiles had been launched from a makeshift stand in a residential neighborhood north of the Green Zone. One of them had hit the top floor but caused little damage. Another landed in the garden. A third struck a house near the launch site. The hotel's narrow north facade wasn't the worry, nor the south, which abutted a mile-long expanse of the Green Zone. The greatest points of vulnerability were the east and western faces, the two long sides with windows. The CPA's security officers had dismissed the chances of a serious attack, assuming that the insurgents didn't have the skill or equipment to target the hotel with accuracy. But residents had been unnerved by the incidents. Sniper attacks and roadside bombings outside the Green Zone had become more frequent. Car bombs had destroyed the Jordanian embassy and the United Nations headquarters, killing the head of the mission, Brazilian diplomat Sergio Vieira de Mello. Intelligence officers began hearing of plots to kidnap foreigners. But the Emerald City, with its 17-foot-high walls and its checkpoints, was supposed to be safe. 20 seconds after the first impact, a second rocket crashed into a concrete awning outside Nimmer's window, shattering the glass and propelling debris into the room. Nimmer began to pray. Please, God, let this be over. The third rocket followed the same trajectory as the second, except it streaked through the clear morning sky at a slightly higher angle. Like the others, it was an 85mm Katyusha, made in Russia. It had probably been sold to Iraq in the 1980s for use against Iran. Thousands had been looted from arms depots after the war. A Katyusha travels at 3 times the speed of sound. If you're standing near one being launched, its sound resembles a high-pitched squeal amplified through a megaphone. If you're on the receiving end, you don't hear a thing until impact. The third rocket flew through the shattered window of room 916 and slammed into the wall to Nimmer's right. He saw a bright flash, as if someone had struck a camera into his face from the rocket's exploring phosphorus warhead. Then he felt a powerful burst of pressurized air from the blast wave. Scalding chunks of the rocket, pieces of wall plaster, slivers from the seal beams, and glass from the light fixtures pierced his flesh like shotgun pellets. The debris slammed onto his head, his back, his legs, singeing his skin. Nimmer screamed. He thought he was going to die. With his next breath, he tried to speak. "Help," he shouted hoarsely. "I need help in here." Burning debris cracked around him. Burning debris crackled around him. Electrical wires sparked. The room filled with smoke and the acrid odor of cordite. In the distance, he could hear shouting. The hotel shuddered from the impact of another rocket, and then it was quiet. "Is anybody there?" he wailed softly. "Somebody, please help me." Nobody called out to him. "I better not shout out anymore. I need to preserve my energy." He tried to crawl, but he only dug himself deeper into the debris. "I know they'll come for me. I have to save my strength." Another rocket hit the hotel, and another. Nimmer counted 7 more rockets after the one that got him. He didn't know it at the time, but the rocket that flew through his window didn't explode in his room. If it had, he wouldn't have been alive to scream. It had punctured the wall and detonated in the bathroom. Much of the force of the blast had traveled away from him, demolishing the closet and the front door and the hallway. One of Nimmer's colleagues on the health ministry team, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Fisher, was living across the hall in room 915. The blast wave was so powerful that it threw him to the ground. In between the explosions, he could hear Nimmer's cries for help, which were growing fainter. "Oh shit," Fisher thought. "He's hurt pretty bad." "Elias," he shouted, "I'm coming to get you." There was no response. Fisher grabbed his rifle and his backpack, which contained his medical kit, and he began to dig his way through the rubble, blocking the door. Nimmer couldn't have been luckier. Fisher was a physician, not just any doctor, but the former director of critical care medicine at the Cleveland Clinic, and he was in the Army's elite special forces. When he reached the hallway, he found a wall of debris blocking Nimmer's door. He picked up what he could and threw it aside. When he entered room 916, he came upon a 220-volt electrical wire dangling from the ceiling and sparking like an arc welder. Crawling under the wire, he began to dig toward Nimmer. "He's dead," Fisher thought at first. Rubble covered much of Nimmer's body. His white t-shirt was soaked with blood, and a large piece of wood had fallen on his head. As Fisher cleared the debris, Nimmer moaned. "Chuck, I can't move," he whispered. "I'm numb from the waist down." 2 South African security contractors shouted into the room from the hallway. "Anybody there?" Fisher asked them to clear a path wide enough to remove the injured man, and then enlisted them to help carry Nimmer to the lobby. Fisher and the South Africans wrapped Nimmer in a blanket and hauled him down 9 flights of stairs. With each bump, Nimmer yelped in pain. The Al-Rashid's lobby was filled with panicked, disoriented CPA staffers. Paul Wolfowitz and his Pentagon entourage had been overnighting at the hotel. They milled around in one corner, surrounded by guards. Wolfowitz was dressed better than anybody else, in slacks and a light blue Oxford shirt, but his hair was hustled and his face ashened. The crowd parted as Nimmer's rescuers carried him into the lobby and then eased him onto the marble floor. A medic began an intravenous drip, and Fisher conducted a fuller assessment of his friend. It didn't look good. He suspected not just brain damage, but a skeletal injury and also serious abdominal and spinal damage. A Humvee ambulance pulled up to collect Nimmer for the short ride to the Green Zone Hospital. Fisher jumped in the back with him. Halfway there, Nimmer removed the crucifix from around his neck and pressed it into Fisher's hand. "Chuck, I don't think I'm going to make it," he said. "Please give this to my wife. It's a family heirloom." At the hospital, Nimmer was placed on a gurney and rolled into the emergency room. "He's an idiot," Fisher shouted. "Roll him in." Surgeons removed 2 large Starbucks-sized cups worth of shrapnel from Nimmer's legs and back. They extricated bits of metal from his vertebrae that had caused the temporary paralysis. Examining his left ear, they discovered that the drum had been blown out. They treated burns on his face caused by the unspent rocket fuel. 15 hours later, he was on a medevac flight to an army hospital in Germany. He would eventually be sent to Walter Reed. He would endure a dozen more surgeries. It would be harrowing, painful, and depressing at times, but he would recover. The Emerald City never would. Thank you.
You both take very different narrative paths in your books. Rajiv, you build yours by placing paving stone after paving stone of these anecdotes together, so that at the end, the reader comes to his or her own conclusion about the emperor having no clothes, about the Wizard of Oz pulling the strings in Washington. Why did you choose, from all of those articles you had written, why did you choose the structure you did to weave them into the story that you wrote?
You know, finding a overarching narrative proved to be incredibly difficult for me because other than Ambassador Bremer, there were so few characters that actually were in Iraq over the course of the entire duration of the 15-month occupation. You had people who came in and out. And so I felt, and the journalism that I was engaged in for the Post during this time was also to some degree episodic. I was focused on individual discrete events, some of which involved the American civilians. Other stories had nothing to do with them. And so it wasn't like I had built, during the time, this running narrative in my mind. And there were no sort of significant characters other than Bremer that sort of rose to the level of that kind of connective glue that you can use for a narrative arc. So I decided to focus instead on place, on the Green Zone, the Emerald City, as the arc, as the structure for this, and then try to essentially weave individual characters in and out, some of which come back and visit us as we go through the book, others of whom simply show up for a chapter or a part of a chapter and go away. But I try to sort of place them next to others who they were connected with in a way to sort of kind of create a interlinked series of characters that help build that arc. I would have loved to have been able to have followed 3 or 4 or 5 people through the entire period and really chart their evolution. But it was just a fact of life that most people simply showed up there for 90 days and then left.
Ben, your language is much more dense than Rajiv's and powerful in its boldness, so that each lyrical vignette is very striking. And we heard that as you read it. You work in both verse and prose. Why both? What does one offer that the other doesn't? And do you view then the whole as a narrative? And how does the change from poetry to prose make that work?
That's an interesting question. I mean, one of the reasons why I use prose poems in this book is because I'm interested in inhabiting and kind of subverting a lot of the prose discourses that we encounter all the time. You know, the language of advertising, the language of the nightly news, supposedly, objective scientific discourse. And so the prose poems are a way of working with that language from the inside, and then defamiliarizing it, right? And in order to kind of combat the desensitizing effect of repetition and cliche in the culture. So prose offers me the opportunity to get into kind of contemporary American English and turn it against itself in a way that I hope is sometimes absurd, sometimes beautiful, sometimes very violent. And so the prose line was the line that I wanted to subvert from within. When I'm writing verse, it's more, that is when the lines are broken, I feel like I'm more interested in kind of trying to imagine new structures for thinking, kind of trying to explore new architectural possibilities. So not just appropriating and defamiliarizing existing vocabularies, but actually trying to kind of push the limits of the language. And a lot of time, that attempt to push the limits of the language results in silence. And one of the powerful things about the poetic line is the way it breaks before the right margin makes silence an active part of the artistic composition. So I think the verse line is an opportunity to try to seek out new linguistic modes and to acknowledge the silence that's involved in such an ambitious task. And the prose lines are more about subverting discourses that I encounter in the world. The question about the narrative is an interesting question. I mean, there's certainly narrative elements in the book. I don't see it as a narrative that develops in any kind of linear way. One of the things I'm really interested in representing is repetition in the way that media saturation is always doubling back on itself. I mean, how many times have you seen the image of the towers collapsing, or Britney Spears' shaved head, for that matter, right? I mean, the repetition of popular imagery, the repetition of the news, and its effect on our ability to perceive reality is one of my primary concerns. So there are narrative elements, but in many ways what I'm trying to represent is what happens to narrative in these conditions of mass media repetition, when you have to somehow still have an emotional response to an image of unimaginable horror, for example, but you see it again and again and again. To me, that's the kind of imagistic equivalent of cliche, when we use language over and over again until it's emptied of meaning. So I'm interested in using repetition in a different way. Repetition elements will recur in the book, like the figure of the astronaut, for example. And my hope is that through the repetition, those figures will become strange again, and the language can be shook loose from its normal uses.
Well, what's next for you both?
For me, I'm back to the world of reporting and writing about Iraq, but instead of being focused on writing a story a day like I was in Baghdad, I'm now pursuing longer form newspaper journalism, 2,000, 3,000 word stories that I spend a couple of weeks on a piece, and that's my agenda for the year. I don't have another active book project. I'm waiting for the right one to gel. I don't just want to sort of jump into it for the sake of doing it. I felt that with this book, I really felt passionate about the subject matter. I felt like there was something I could add that was unique, and I need to find the right story. I don't know if it's going to be something else related to Iraq or something completely different. I'd like to write another book at some point, but I can't tell you exactly when.
I hope I'm working on a book. I mean, it seems like I spend like 4 hours writing and then 4 hours erasing a day. But I do have something going that I haven't turned on totally yet, which is kind of, related to the conversations we've been having. I'm trying to figure out what it would mean to kind of write a love poem with a language that's also, implicated in war and economic conditions that I don't necessarily support. So I'm writing a poem which is both an attempt at being a love poem for my wife, but also very much a poem about the possibility of writing such a poem in such a time. So I'm trying to write kind of my ambivalence into the project. I'm trying to find a form that can both, express traditional emotions, which is, of course, one of the oldest tasks of poetry, but that can also acknowledge the complexity of doing that with a language that's implicated in so many murderous projects. So that's the impossible challenge that I'm kind of thinking about these days.
Good. Well, thank you both for being with us tonight. This has been delightful to hear you read those books in your own voice and to hear you talk about your writing.
Well, please join me in thanking this group for this most engaging evening. You are invited to a reception in the Ilsacher Library where the authors will be available to sign their books and where we will continue the conversation. Tomorrow morning at 10:40 here in the Centrum, we will hold the honors convocation and hear an address from Harold Augenbaum entitled The Metaphysics of the American Literary Industry. Good night.